born Lafayette Ronald Hubbard on March 13, 1911 in Tilden, Nebraska. He spent his formative years in a rough and tumble Helena, Montana, where he rode barely broken range broncs at the age of 3.5. As his mother was that rarity of her time, a thoroughly educated woman, he was also reading well beyond his years: philosophy, science, and the pillars of Western literature, all in an effort to satisfy a rare and abiding curiosity. As his father was a United States naval officer, he was further afforded a then rare opportunity to travel, crisscrossing America's diverse communities in the teens of the 20th century. At the age of 12, he entered the Boy Scouts, first leading his troop to victory in a regional scout advancement competition, then representing scouting to United States President Calvin Coolidge. But it was his 21 merit badges that most distinguished L. Ron Hubbard at this juncture of his life. For just days beyond his 13th birthday, he became the youngest Eagle Scout in American history. It was another distinction entirely, however, that set him on the first leg of his life's course. Specifically, when an American naval officer who had studied under Sigmund Freud introduced young L. Ron Hubbard to the theories of psychoanalysis. Although left with many unanswered questions, here was the moment when his enduring interest in unraveling the mysteries of the human mind was born. His father's naval career provided the next avenue of inquiry, in particular, a Far East assignment allowing the 16-year-old L. Ron Hubbard a chance to visit Asia. It was land still steeped in mystery and rarely seen by Westerners, yet pursuing very fundamental questions on the origins of man and the ultimate source of life. He trekked more than 250,000 miles through India, China, Japan, and the Philippines, into many remote cultures and much arcane wisdom, including Vedic hymns at the root of mankind's oldest beliefs. It was also through these travels he gained entrance to forbidden Buddhist lamaseries in China's western hills, and there witnessed wonders beyond any known scientific explanation. Shortly after his return to the United States in 1929, he entered George Washington University as an engineering student. It was a rigorous curriculum of scientific methodology, the very tools he needed to examine human thinking with unerring accuracy. Here, too, was one of America's earliest classes on nuclear physics, through which he embarked on yet another investigatory trail, this one to isolate a postulated life source, theoretically detectable in small energy particles. Yet laboratory experimentation was by no means all that occupied his university days. Beginning in June of 1932, he organized the first of several expeditions to remote and primitive lands. Initially, a 5,000-mile voyage into the Caribbean, where he mingled with a people predating Columbus by at least 10 centuries. Next came Puerto Rico, where he not only conducted one of the island's first complete mineralogical surveys, but also studied yet another ancient culture deep within the hinterland. Then, taking his thirst for adventure to the skies, he became America's 385th licensed glider pilot. Heralded by newspapers of the day as Flash Hubbard for his aerial antics, while as a barnstorming sensation of powered flight across rural America, he mixed with still another slice of society. Then, leaving university in the depths of the Great Depression, he began his career as a professional author, turning his true-to-life exploits into high-action tales for magazines of the day. Tales of adventure, tales of intrigue, science fiction, fantasies, westerns, and even the occasional romance. As an undisputed legend of American pulp fiction, L. Ron Hubbard wrote it all. Indeed, with more than 300 novels and novelettes to his credit, so prodigious was his output, he was eventually authoring stories under 15 pen names, and so filling whole magazines with his work. He was also scripting matinee blockbusters for Hollywood, and otherwise leaving an indelible stamp as an author whose career would span 50 years. Then, just as exploits fueled story ideas, so his stories funded still more exploration, until he was regularly crisscrossing the country to live extreme adventures and mix with people as far afield as Native American tribes along the Alaskan Panhandle. In recognition of discoveries in the field, he was further honored with a place in the prestigious and invitation-only Explorers Club, and so went on to captain expeditions beneath 3 club flags. But the real point of such adventures was the fact he was mixing with life to fathom life. The first decisive breakthrough came in 1937, when he isolated the single common denominator between all living things, a dynamic principle of existence. It was recorded in a manuscript entitled Excalibur, and presented the basis for all future research into the mind and source of life. But then came an interruption to that research, the Second World War. As he had since earned a rare Master Mariner's license to captain any vessel in any ocean, he received numerous recommendations for commission as a naval officer. In particular, he was described discreet, loyal, honest, and without peer in the art of getting things done. So it was, Lieutenant L. Ron Hubbard commanded warships in both the Atlantic and Pacific. He was highly decorated for duties under fire, and ended his service in a military hospital where he was treated for wounds suffered in combat. But that's also where he embarked on his final road of discovery. Working with injured servicemen who had failed to recover despite intensive medical care, he began employing all he had learned through the previous decades, spiritual principles from the East, as well as scientific methodologies from the West. What he then discovered were mental factors inhibiting recovery and preventing medicines from taking effect. And when in fact those mental blocks were addressed, the medicine began to work, and patients swiftly returned to health. He then continued refining procedures on people from all walks of life, actors and writers in Hollywood's film community, street gang members whom he treated as a special officer with the LAPD, even deeply troubled patients at a Georgia institution. And so it was, having developed a workable technology of the mind, he authored a definitive text on the subject, a work detailing all underlying theory, discoveries, and techniques. That book was Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health, published on May 9, 1950. It sparked a storm of popular enthusiasm and wrote bestseller lists for 100 consecutive weeks. As such, it was the biggest selling book on the mind ever written, and remains so today. Contained within was the discovery of the reactive mind, the hidden source of nightmares, unreasonable fears, upsets, and insecurity. Yet L. Ron Hubbard never considered Dianetics an end to his research, but rather a stepping stone to the discovery and isolation of that long elusive life source. And indeed, the techniques of Dianetics provided the means by which practitioners soon began discovering past lives. Pressing application and research even further came the accomplishment of what is known as exteriorization, demonstrating the spirit was indeed separable from the body and mind. The Scientology religion was born. Thereafter, L. Ron Hubbard delved ever deeper into the spiritual nature of man, documenting his discoveries in thousands of recorded lectures, articles, and books. While to present those discoveries, he literally circumnavigated the globe, and so churches of Scientology opened on 4 continents, headquartered at his long-term residence in southern England. Through ensuing years, L. Ron Hubbard continued advancing the subject until his passing in 1986. His legacy comprises tens of millions of published words and 3,000 recorded lectures. While with over 300 million copies of his books and lectures in circulation, he has inspired a movement spanning all continents and all cultures. So to those who would ask, what kind of man could have founded the only major religion of the 20th century? The answer is simple enough. A man who lived life from the top down and the bottom up. A man who had seen much wisdom and great suffering. A man who spent a quarter of a century bridging the gap between East and West, science and religion. A man such as L. Ron Hubbard. As was said of those who trekked to the ends of this earth, so it was said of L. Ron Hubbard. You had to live large or fall before the unknown. Among other early adventures was a 1928 voyage from Micronesia to the South China coast. Upon venturing north from Shanghai to Peking, came what is remembered as L. Ron Hubbard's Asian trek, of which the stories are legend. Whereafter came all else distinguishing a most adventurous L. Ron Hubbard: his service with Montana State's National Guard. The same again with Washington, D.C.'s 20th Marine Corps Reserves. And more again with his Caribbean expedition, yielding discoveries still found in Smithsonian archives and New York Times photographic vaults. But even so, that was just a prelude to what ensued after L. Ron Hubbard's entrance to the International Explorers Club. Captain Hubbard eventually led 3 expeditions beneath hallowed club flags, and his place in exploratory annals is rare indeed. His July 1940 radio experimental expedition from Puget Sound to Alaska's Panhandle, his Puerto Rican mineralogical survey, his coral specimens from the Great Sargasso Sea, and his archaeological expedition to ancient civilizations in the Mediterranean. But it's his map across the face of humanity where he searched for the origins of man that best tells this story. So, from that league of adventurous gentlemen who scoured this world to answer timeless questions, here again is L. Ron Hubbard, in his own words and his own voice.
There was nothing tougher than Montana, either in terms of weather or in terms of people. And from there, I went over to the completely soft Far East and heaved a long sigh of relief and found out what it meant to be in part of a civilization. And the shock was so great to me that I was very deeply impressed. And so, although I was a young American, I did pay attention. I had many, many friends in the western hills of China, friends elsewhere, friends in India, and I was willing to listen. I was also willing to be very suspicious, and I was willing to be very distrustful. But I was never willing to completely turn aside from the fact that there was some possible solution to the riddle of where man came from. I was a school teacher when I was 16 down in the South Pacific and had a bunch of 40 little native children, all of whom talked Chamorro. And I was teaching them English and so forth as a paid school teacher. It was very wild trying to give them the idea of what is a skyscraper. They asked me about some of these wonders they had been talked about, and they couldn't understand any of them. They'd never seen a big building. They had never seen a train. They'd never seen any of these things. And it was actually a great contest on my part to get enough of the things they were familiar with added up in enough ways so that they could understand these other things. In other words, to get the bridging substitutes. Finally, I drew on a blackboard 50 nipa shacks, one piled on top of another one, and they finally conceived what the Empire State Building must be like. It was just a planning stage in those days. was very amusing.
I remember one time learning Igoroti in a single night. I sat up by a kerosene lantern and took a list of words that had been made by an old missionary. Igoroti, these are people up in Luzon in the Philippines. They have a very, very simple sort of baby talk language. And this missionary had phoneticized their language, and he had made a list of the main words and their uses and their grammar and so on. And I remember sitting up under a mosquito net with the mosquitoes very, very hungrily chomping their beaks just outside the net, and learning this language, 300 words. Just simply sat down and memorized these 300 words and knew what they meant. And the next day started to get them in line and align them with people, you see, and was speaking Igoroti in a very short space of time. This is very easy since it's a very, very simple language. It only has 300 words in it. I think the usual university student uses 400 or 500 words as his standard vocabulary. But Igoroti, you see, is almost as bright then as the average university student.
Magic is something that today is performed on a stage with prestidigitation. Magic actually has a much more vivid and noble history than a stage magician. It is quite remarkable that the magician attempts directly to use spirits to perform his will, and that is his basic modus operandi. That is his goal in practicing magic. And thus we find in the days of Kublai Khan in North China a corps of magicians who were employed to blow up storms to obfuscate the enemy, who were employed even in such mundane affairs as serving dinner, and they would conjure wine bottles through the air. They would fly through the air and pour a drink and fly back onto the sideboard, you see. The magician was not really germane or native, you might say, to China. He was an imported article, but he certainly flourished in China. And the last of them was used as an intelligence agent by Major McVane. Whatever his name was, it was a very, very fancy name. I couldn't remember it, and I never put it down anyplace. He was known as Mayo. Mayo is actually colloquial for merely good. And the old man was certainly good. He was, at the time I knew him, 87 years old. And he was as agile as a rubber doll. He was quite remarkable. But this old fellow was the last surviving magician of the line that came in with Kublai Khan. Now, Lord knows how long that line had been before that. And he supported himself with displays of magic, merely prestidigitation, no more than that. And I made his acquaintance, and we became very good friends. The old man could do some of the more remarkable things, such as do a front somersault and plant a pottery urn on the floor, do a back somersault and have a small tree, do a front somersault and have a full-grown orange tree with oranges on it. It would just appear flip, flip, flip. and then do one more flip, and a bowl of fish would appear on the floor with the fish swimming around merrily. Now, he carried all of these things under his gown, and by a series of hooks would detach one item and attach the item he picked up to his belt and throw his skirt down and cover them. It's quite remarkable. He probably put up with me for various reasons, but when he began to talk of ancient wisdom, why, he talked of things that were marvelous and beyond at least my understanding. Not totally. But this old man knew his business. He knew his business.
Now, one day up in the cold and dust of a Pekin winter and so on, I saw a Chinese carpenter. Working. And it's the wildest thing I'd ever seen, because there's an old civilization, and a very old civilization. You expect them to be very sophisticated in all of their tools and so on. This little Chinese carpenter was working out there in the cold, and he was mending up the pillars of the British legation. They were built out of wood, and they'd been gnawed at by dust for a long time, and they had some carvings and some things like this associated with them. And he was fitting in a new beam and so on for one that had been rotted out, and he was fitting it all in very nicely. And I talked to him for a little while, and I stood there just absolutely fascinated. This man had a little bow and was about 6 inches long, and had a piece of string in the two corners of the bow, and he had a drill that he had taken out of a fish that he had had for breakfast. And he had a little piece of stone that he'd picked up in the street, which happened to have a little concavity in the back of it. And he took the fishbone and wrapped the string of the little bow around it, and then held it with this palm fitting, this stone, and went up and down with the fishbowl, and he had a nice auger, and he was drilling holes in the wood, and then he was taking then a little knife that was hardly a knife at all. It was just a sliver of metal that he had managed to sharpen up, and he was taking bits of wood off of the old beam. Of course, he was discarding. He wouldn't use new wood for this, and he was taking these things, and he'd flick up a little piece like off there, and then he'd go saw, and next thing you know, he had a dowel, and then he put the dowel where he had drilled the hole, and then he'd tap it in with his with this same stone. He was building more beam faster than U.S. carpenter. I looked at this, and he was perfectly competent with these tools. And he was taking the greatest of care, and he was making the nicest possible things out of things. Interesting, isn't it? This little fellow, in other words, was perfectly capable of doing a job with, of course you could say, tools to which he was accustomed, but using a minimum of tools. Man, I think to do the same job, nobody would have been putting something together with wooden dowels anyway. They would have been nailing it together with nails at vast expense and so on. You say, well, what about this fellow? Well, this fellow actually had never really been spoiled by being taught all of the things he had to have before he was a carpenter.
I was with a bunch of criminals one time as a ranger up in the Montana when I was a kid. Rangers have to take over crews of tramps and so forth sometimes in order to fight forest fires. You suddenly find yourself with numerous fellows who have recently left Joliet without being properly discharged. Now, these criminals and bums did a pretty good job fighting fire. Criminals can't work. That's mainly what's wrong with them. And you have to work real hard with criminals to get them to work at all. And however, one of them got his boots practically burned off his feet, so I loaned him a pair of boots that I had, an extra pair of boots. He was on another crew by the time I left the area, and I went back to Helena. And when I got back to Helena, I said to myself, well, I'll never see those boots again. This fellow stole a car and drove 200 miles. And he returned me my boots. They have strange ways of transacting business in life, but they are seldom scared. You find all sorts of interesting complications, but very little viciousness.
When I got into college, I needed a little recreation. Life was dull. A fella came up to me and he says, the Marine Reserves are organizing a 20th Regiment. Why don't you come down? So I went down and I found out nobody down there knew to the rear march, to the rear march, to the rear march. And I happened to know to the rear march, to the rear march, to the rear march. So I went around to the captain and I said, I'll join up if you give me a sergeantcy. I was 19. The only reason I knew anything about drilling is been hanging around with the Marines off and on. So they made me a first sergeant. So I got my hair cut off short. Got it sticking up like bristles, pig's back. Stood in front of a mirror for a while and I got this look on my face, the way I'd seen the most successful sergeants look. I cultivated a method of talking like that. And, geez, I even scared myself.
I had a pal one time, back about 1930. We went on a barnstorming trip out of Washington. We were flying an old, I think it was an airplane. I think it had an engine, it had wheels. Personally, I believe he picked it off the ground and carried it around in the air. I don't think it had anything to do with the aerodynamics of flight, because looking over the aerodynamics of that aircraft since, I haven't been able to find any flying characteristics in it of any kind whatsoever. This was almost as bad as the type of aircraft just a little earlier than that, where they test whether or not a flying wire was gone between the two wings. They turn a pigeon loose, and if it escaped, why, there was a wire gone. Yeah, these were the days.
He was the nation's youngest Eagle Scout at the age of 13, and twice journeyed to Asia before the advent of commercial flight. He attended America's first class on nuclear physics and was a pioneer at the dawn of American aviation. He led expeditions into then remote islands as a member of the famed Explorers Club and was a giant in the golden age of pulp fiction. He was a master mariner, licensed to captain vessels on any ocean, and a United States naval officer who commanded corvettes during World War II. His landmark work on the human mind rode bestseller lists for 100 consecutive weeks. And he's the most published and translated author of all time. He is L. Ron Hubbard, founder of Scientology.
I remember the first, you might say, command I ever had was a Doris Hamlin, 1,000 tons berthing out of Baltimore. Four-mast schooner, 200 feet between perpendiculars, twin deck. Lovely old ship. She had been built for World War I, and they had built her on cost plus 10, so her cabins were all walnut, and she was made out of oak, you know, the most expensive materials they could possibly get into her so they'd get their 10% of it. And then it had never been finished during the war, but the contract was so written that it continued on and was completed after the war. So she was brought right up to after the war, and then she was sold for $4,000. Her rigging cost $120,000. And she had sat in the dead ship pool practically from then right up to the time I picked her up was for an expeditionary vessel and fitted her up with a bathysphere and underwater motion picture equipment and so on, and she was real good. And I picked up kids, fairly young kids, one kind or another, made a crew out of them. Her trucks were 125 feet above the deck, and that is high above a deck. That's high. You get all the way up to the topmost truck on something like that, and when you look down, and that truck is swinging, you see, and that mast is making huge, irregular swoops around the sky. And that deck way down there is lilting this way and that way, and one moment you're over the sea to the starboard, and one moment you're over the sea to port. And it's quite high. Now, in order to tack, she was a topsail schooner. And in order to tack her, you had to bring her topsails across the chains, which is to say you had to send somebody up to the main truck, mizzen and so forth, in order to unfasten a chain and fasten the topsail over on the other side. Otherwise she would belly against the shrouds and so on. In other words, 4 men had to go aloft, scampering like monkeys every time you tacked across the wind. And believe me, in some passes, you tack often. But you know, these young fellows had no difficulty whatsoever in learning this. They had no difficulty in doing this. And it was outside my sphere of understanding later on when I had difficulty in teaching anyone about an iron ship. Iron ships are kind of, you know, a yachtsman that's fond of sailing ships calls all these motorboats stink pots. You know. And running an iron ship around with big motors that always run, you know. You're not suddenly taken aback and your wind doesn't suddenly veer on you and you're not caught in a tide race with no wind. You know, your motive power is always assured. You never have to make judgment way in advance. running a sailing ship, particularly of any size, is a matter, you got to be half genius and half clairvoyant. And if you're those things, why, you sail them successfully. Up in the Arctic one time, I was on an expedition. One of the natives that was loading some barges kept just sitting off to the side, not helping his fellow natives, just sitting off to the side and doing nothing. And pretty soon, I heard one of them call him a whatever it was. Nobody can learn this Eskimo tongue. It's a very rough tongue. And he called him a row. Well, I'd heard myself call a row too, so I was very, very curious, you see. Well, of course, the white man always has a very lordly idea of how he's regarded by the lesser races. He's after all the commanding race and so on. But they were calling me a row and calling him a row too didn't sit well. So I put the foreman of this crew in a brace and I said, "What does that mean?" Oh, he said, "He's lazy, he's no good." And I said, "Well, what is your word for being lazy and no good?" And he says, "White man." So in the course of one's researches, one doesn't necessarily have to learn humility, but he very definitely should have a fairly thick skin. I would hate to think that my control of human beings was so bad that I had to govern them by blackmail. I should think it would be such a forceful self-criticism that I was slipping. I myself never found it necessary. And as a matter of fact, governed a ship of criminals one time. The whole ship, 100%. They were on their way to Portsmouth Naval Prison. They took them off the prison train and shipped them to me. Combat vessel, needed a crew. They didn't have any crews. Had a lot of people in uniform, but didn't have people they wanted to send out into the teeth of the North Atlantic in 1942. I saw them come aboard with their braid dirty and their hammocks black with grime. They stood there slouched. And that was the first intimation I had that this was the crew. And there they were, more than 100 men lined up on the deck. And I said, "These fellows have had it." And I asked the yeoman, "What's this all about?" "I don't know, sir." I said, "We'll get their service record books. Let's take a look." They were all scheduled for Portsmouth Naval Prison for years of imprisonment, and yet they thought it'd be better to send them to the war. So I took their service record books, an enormous pile of them, took them out in front of them, and I said, "You see these books? I'm not going to make a mark in them. Whatever you do is between you and me. And if you're willing to put up with what punishments I give you, you're willing to serve this ship, maybe we'll survive the war. But as far as these service records are concerned, I care nothing about them. Dumped them in a mailbag and never looked at them from that time henceforward. I didn't even know what crimes these men were assigned for. Took a lot of doing. But all of a sudden, these men were standing sea watches in undress blues, merely because they thought it would look better. They were quite remarkable. All I had done was take the weight of super officialdom and dossiers off their back. I'd set them free to that degree. And they made a splendid crew.
One day I was a division navigator, navigating for a division, and one of the boys had insisted that when the ship was being fixed up and so forth, that we have glass panels put across the navigator's desk in such a way that you could read the chronometer directly through them. Well, I got awfully tired of trying to read the chronometers at all because they were Navy chronometers, and I was navigating on Air Force watches. And Navy chronometers, they had to be changed. They had errors in them. You set your Air Force watches every morning, you see, by Arlington. And they were perfectly accurate Hamiltons. And so I just had these old chronometers moved out of there, and here was a nice big empty hole. So a big hole, you see, beautifully glass paneled and black velvet and so forth. And I looked at this hole, I thought, that's gorgeous. So I got myself a nice goldfish bowl and turned it upside down on it to have a perfect crystal ball. And it was a standard gag. Then somebody come in and asked me in fog at night and so forth, where are we? I say, well, you can look as well as I can and point to this thing. So it was enough for somebody to come in, and if I didn't know exactly what we were doing or it was hard to find out, it was just a gesture at the crystal ball. And one day, the Admiral wandered into the navigating shack and so forth. He said, what are we using here? So forth. And I said, well, here's the dead reckoning tracer, and here are your fathometer logs, and here's this and that, and the radar room, and the CIC, and so forth. And every time I mentioned one of these things, they were all new contraptions that they hadn't had aboard sailing vessels, so he was very disinterested. And so I finally attracted his interest by simply saying he just wasn't giving me any interest, you see. I mean, I'd say CIC, Combat Information Center, which is a terrifically complex organizations of fed information into a central spot, worked like a brain. And this was blank. I pointed to the crystal ball, and I said, well, that actually, between ourselves, sir, is what I use usually. Expecting from an old sea dog, you see, anybody who'd been a navigator, he'd get a good laugh out of this. See, he'd walk out of the shack feeling good. He walked out of the shack all right. And a little while later, the skipper found me down in the officer's wardroom, and he was almost incapable of restraining his mirth. He said, you know, I've just had a complaint about you. The Admiral had come up to the captain's bridge and had told the captain that the captain had better keep an eye on me because I wasn't using modern equipment. I thought it might be an awfully good thing to become a member of a police force for a little while to find out what they were scared of. And I did. Became a special officer in the Los Angeles Police. I wanted to find where these vicious criminals were making them so frightened. I had a beat down on South Main Street. They didn't know who I was, and they were very friendly with me because I was something they could understand, a policeman. But down on South Main Street, amongst the gyps, grifts, and the dopes, the hopheads, the tea eaters, the rest of them, amongst these people, I thought I would find my answer. I was in bars and dens and things where I didn't know man could go that far south. I only had one fellow ever give me any real trouble, who was awfully drunk after having been high on marijuana. And he kept coming alongside of me and grabbing my gun out of its holster because he wanted to shoot his best friend. In view of the fact that the gun was unloaded, never bothered with a loaded gun, the cartridges are heavy. I kept taking it away from him and putting it back in the holster and snapping it down, explaining to him that that wasn't what you did with friends. But he couldn't understand this, and I finally sat him down over in the corner of the cafe. He grabbed once too often when I had my back to him after he hadn't bothered me for half an hour. And I gave him a push, and he knocked down a couple of tables, and I apologized to the proprietor, took him over and sat him down back of a table and poured him a glass of warm water filled with salt. And I told him that was the best scotch and soda he ever drank, and it was on me. Well, after he'd gotten rid of it, he came around my next time past that place, and he told me that he had decided something. And I asked him what he had decided, and he said he had decided that one should not shoot his friends. This was a wonderful thing. That was the only man that ever gave me trouble, and he actually didn't have any real malice in his heart at all. It was just sort of a sport he was engaged in. Where are all these tough human beings? I admit that some man occasionally will become afraid and will become totally gripped by the belief that there is menace in every fellow man. I admit that a human being can become so aberrated as to constitute a menace to the bulk of the society. And that in such a case, it is necessary to reacquaint him with society. But I will not admit that there is a naturally bad, evil man on earth. I have lived with men of many races, colors, and creeds, many barbaric tribes, 12 different tribes of men of the most barbaric and malign nature you ever heard of. I've never had man, unless he were in an insane state,
completely insane state offer me any harm in any part of the world? That's very interesting, isn't it? I was chalking up my mileage one time when it was 250,000 miles before I was 21. And in all those places, I never had anyone who was sane offer me any physical harm or threat, but quite on the contrary, have received a gourd of water when well needed it from headhunters. Have received food and shelter from storms in the most unlikely places. From people whom you would believe by all the descriptions you read everywhere would be the worst possible people to associate with. So we can assume then that somebody must be telling a lie about man. If you can walk into a tribe of headhunters and you not only keep your head, but you find yourself cracking jokes over this and that, and after you've overcome your slight queasiness at your host dipping into the common pot and picking out a very choice piece of meat to hand you with his bare hand, which he's not washed for some months. And if you can overcome that hand and your suspicion that it's probably dog that you're eating, why, you've overcome about all of the upset you're going to meet. Well, this is an interesting thing, isn't it? Man must also engage then upon another game about lying about the other guy. See, he must also engage in this game. Now, wandering around and hanging up my hat on the breadfruit tree and squatting alongside of evilly smelling fires in villages where the movies would teach you a spear could be expected any moment, and never finding any such conditions existing, I came to the rather outrageous conclusion, very young, that I have never since departed from. And that was that it doesn't matter what part of the world you're in. If you're sane, and, which is to say, sociable, there isn't anything that can happen to it. So, with the conclusion of this character, I've kept the only modification that man in an insane state is insane only because he has ceased to be social. It is closer to the native beingness of man to be good than to be bad. Now, this is not slippery logic. It just happens to work that way.
It has been said that L. Ron Hubbard lived 20 lives in the span of one. At the age of 6, he earned a hallowed place in Blackfeet lore. At 13, he was honored as the nation's youngest Eagle Scout. And he twice journeyed to a then mysterious Asia before the advent of commercial flight, and was a pioneer at the dawn of American aviation. A giant in the golden age of pulp fiction, creator of tales that will resonate forever. A member of the famed Explorers Club, leader of expeditions to uncharted lands. The author of Dianetics, the world's most widely read work on the human mind. And founder of Scientology, the only major religion to emerge in the 20th century. This is a profile of L. Ron Hubbard, and your invitation to get to know the life, the legacy, the man.
Scientology Network presents L. Ron Hubbard in his own voice, an exclusive 3-part documentary series. He captivated an audience with his extraordinary knowledge of the mind and changed the lives of millions worldwide. Now, for the first time in this unforgettable series, hear the stories from the man that founded the world's youngest major religion. Don't miss L. Ron Hubbard in his own voice.
This is an invitation to freedom.
Man can save his soul.
Like a bright, cool dawn after a night of prison and of thunder, we can taste that freedom sought so long.
It does not come with the blares of trumpets or the flare and flash of flame. It's come quietly, and you aren't at all sure you should believe it.
The mysteries of existence lie before our eyes.
You are a spirit. You are your own soul. You are not mortal.
You can be free.
You have been invited.
Buy and read Dianetics. Discover the reactive mind and how you can get rid of it.
This holiday season, celebrate family and friends. Celebrate goodwill and peace. Happy holidays from Scientology Network. A Scientology Network original series.
You walk into the city and it just is there saying, hello.
We're just in the heart of everything.
When they come in here, we're just like, what's up? We have your language, like, here you go.
It's such an amazing place to be.
Don't miss Destination Scientology, Mondays at 9 on Scientology Network.